Is Dr. Appleton? There you are. Our first speaker, our first questioner will be a brief discussion, 4 or 5 minutes from Dr. Appleton, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I've been given 5 minutes to try to be as provocative as possible and try to bring the discussion together. Let me say from the beginning, you're a very eminent panel. I'm coming from the private sector, and my views are going to differ a little bit. First of all, we were talking about, I think, the idea of business as usual will not work. That was our starting point. But we seem to have come with a lot of ideas that are business as usual. And we haven't really advanced the discussion in the way that I hoped we were going to move. We haven't really hit the fundamental themes in a practical, pragmatic way of inclusion, sustainability, and growth, as I thought we were going to. I'm not sure we're preparing enough ammunition for the big UNCTAD meeting that's going to follow. Let me try to justify this, and I apologize to the panel. I am being provocative, I know. First of all, Christoph did a very good job of setting forth the agenda and the problems, but the solutions aren't there. We didn't talk really about the type of taxation schemes, the type of investment, the type of governance, an issue we never talk about in this House, governance issues that are going to be necessary to end business as usual. Because inclusive growth means bringing in a lot of portions of the world where governance issues still exist. I would like to hear more about the kind of investment policy we need to spur development and inclusive growth. And I would like to hear more about what the role of government should be to address issues like sustainability, because we all know that externalities are not going to be addressed without some kind of government influence. I'm a big advocate of private sector involvement, but I don't think the private sector alone can solve all aspects of the inclusive growth and sustainability conundrum. Bernard hit, of course, the nail on the head when he talks about employment. And I think you're quite right. Employment and bringing growth through employment is a major portion of the problem. And I think the China and India examples where we do see a lot of growth in employment are important. And I agree with your starting point that the old agenda still matters. I think this is extremely important. Issues like trade facilitation, protectionism are very important. Tariffs in the developing world are still relatively high for many products. And we need to bring this point to bear. How can we move forward even with the old agenda? Because quite frankly, the old agenda is not going away. We all know that. It's a question of tweaking the old agenda, making it work better. My friend Vera's ideas on exchange rate, we've talked about this many, many times. At the risk of being, again, provocative, if the real is so overvalued, why is everything in Brazil so expensive? One issue that Vera did not put on the table are non-tariff barriers. Trying to export something to Brazil is a nightmare, and we know that. There are other problems than exchange rates. Exchange rates are not going to be resolved in the WTO, and also exchange rates is an issue of winners and losers. Brazil is negatively affected right now. The US and China are probably benefiting greatly from the present alignment. So we need to see this probably from a broader perspective. Again, is this an issue we're going to address at UNCTAD, exchange rate alignments? I'm not so sure, but it's definitely provocative, and you presented it very, very well. Craig looked at a very, very narrow portion of the problem, which also being from the States, of course, has some relevance, trade adjustments assistance. But I think Craig's presentation and Vera's presentation, to some extent, look at the politics of the problem and not necessarily solutions for the problem. How can trade adjustment assistance be fashioned or refashioned does get to the question of how we can fix the problem, but trade adjustment assistance is not going to solve the underlying major problems of encouraging foreign direct investment, making sure that the governance frameworks will support foreign direct investment, making sure that businesses can operate in a way that promotes development, and making sure that these externalities are addressed. Pollution, environment, climate change become so important. I think in conclusion, the point that I would really like to make is that we perhaps need to restart the debate from the question of what should be the role of government in these changing times. What should our governments be doing? Where are they failing? Where are governments failing? How can we address these government issues to hit the big themes that we all agree are important? Inclusive growth, sustainability, and economic growth in general. Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator.
And thank you very much. Those are exactly the questions that I think we need to try to focus on for the next hour and a half or so that we have for debate. And I'm sure the Minister would be very grateful for your comments and suggestions, because that's her task, to come from this workshop and to go to UNCTAD XIII and talk in quite concrete terms about the kinds of trade policy objectives, trade policy institutions that governments need to try to adjust to this changed world. So I invite your comments and your questions for the panel. Please indicate to me if you would like to intervene, and please identify yourself and use the microphone before you begin. Do we have questions or comments? Professor Lehman.
Dr. Lehman, this is really just to get the ball rolling, and I'm sure it'll pick up momentum. But I just wanted to say, and I guess I'm referring mainly to Christoph, but also to the other panelists, is, what if we're wrong? What if we're wrong about a lot of the assumptions that we're making about the world economy? I'm always rather skeptical about these projections of what proportion of certain countries' global GDP is going to be. I lived in Japan in the 1980s, when it was forecast that it would overtake the U.S. economy in 2004, and sort of went up the hill, went down the hill, etc. So I think that and what if we're wrong, in the sense that the Chinese and the Indians and others don't realize the potential that we're imposing on them? I mean, a lot of things going on at the moment in both countries that could slow growth. And if we envisage a scenario of low growth in China and India and in other developing countries, I mean, this is going to have a huge impact, Vera, on Brazil, irrespective of exchange rates. So how are we in a position to cope with a dysfunction of the global economy, one in which there's been, Martin Wolf, among others, has been predicting that there could be a financial crisis in China in the relatively near future, etc. So I think that, and particularly here, the roles of government are going to be absolutely critical. So I think that there should be an effort made to try to identify various kinds of scenarios, including ones where it's not going to be just a question of inclusive growth; it's just going to be a question of growth and whether there will be growth in the world economy. I hope that was provocative.
So, Christoph, what if you're wrong?
Yeah, I mean, good question. What if we're wrong? And in fact, actually, when I was preparing this presentation, I asked myself exactly the same question. I mean, you're looking at predictions, you're looking at figures, and we know that we're not particularly good at predicting the future. So it's entirely possible that we might completely wrong, that we might have a slowdown in growth in China and India, and that will completely change the whole equation. Of course, there are still a number of I think, issues and challenges that will remain. Issues related to climate change, the fisheries, and so on and so forth. I mean, these are problems that are present. I mean, they're not just problems for the future, but it's true that it's quite difficult to make those predictions. So I very much like this idea of looking at different kind of possible scenarios and what might be the different implications of all these different scenarios for government policy making. But beyond that, I'm not sure exactly what to say.
I'm Peter Draper. I'll be moderating later. So I wanted to also take Christoph up on his offer to talk about the Sustainable Energy Trade Agreement. Given that it seems that nothing's moving in the WTO, the climate change talks are very difficult to advance, what exactly do you have in mind, both in terms of substance but also process? Are you talking, for instance, about a plurilateral trade agreement, which is something I think that we should be discussing in a forum such as this? Or do you have something else in mind? And then also to Vera, it was a very interesting analysis, and you ended up by saying that you want to neutralize the effects of currency misalignments in the WTO. But what I missed is how precisely you intend to do that.
Christoph.
Well, thanks, Peter. Well, this idea of a sustainable energy trade agreement, I think the starting point is kind of this realization that we need a much faster, a much more kind of effective scale-up of innovation, but also use and diffusion of non-fossil fuels or kind of renewable energies technology. So that's the first assumption. The second assumption is that trade can play an important role in this respect, but we might not have the adequate kind of governance framework to make sure that we have good markets, well-functioning global supply chains, and therefore there might be a need for some kind of intergovernmental approach. What we have suggested basically would be an agreement among a group of interested countries to try to address the kind of governance gap that we have in this area. So in terms of well, first in terms of coverage, there could be lots of different options. I mean, you could start either with a kind of narrow kind of focus, which would essentially look at goods and services, looking at services that are required, to associated with renewable energies, goods that are linked to again renewable energies in wind, solar, in many different areas. So a kind of narrow focus just on a small basket of goods, or you could have a much broader coverage that would also include a number of other policies, looking at government procurement, looking at issues of local content requirements, which we've seen has been a major issue as governments try to promote the scaling up or the diffusion of renewable energy. They tend at the same time to also try to make sure that this generates jobs and ideally job in your country. So many of these things come with local content requirement. We've seen this dispute between Ontario and Japan on feed-in tariffs. So local content requirement might be an issue. Investment, export restrictions. I mean, there's a whole debate now on rare earths and export restrictions in the area of rare earths. We know that rare earth is something that is quite important in the production and generation of some renewable energy. You want to extend it to that. Issues of standards, harmonizing standards, efficiency standards, subsidies. So there's a wide range of issues that could be included in such an agreement. Now, to be realistic, it's probably safer and easier to start with a rather narrow scope and maybe expand it in the future. Now, in terms of where this could be negotiated, should it be a plurilateral agreement? Again, I mean, we as ICTSD, we don't have any particular format that we are trying to advocate. I think there are many different ways of doing it. In the WTO itself, I mean, the issue of plurilateral agreement is not new. I mean, it's been there for quite some time. We have the GPA model. We have the ITA model. I mean, to be provocative, I could even argue that this whole approach in the EGS negotiations with the kind of request and offer that was something that was suggested is also some sort of a plurilateral agreement at the end of the day, because you're only dealing with a handful of countries that play really an important role in this area. I think what would be important from my own perspective is that the results of this agreement is extended on an MFN basis. We know that there are probably a handful of countries that are really major players in this area, and you would need to have those countries on board. But ideally, if we could extend any kind of benefits on an MFN basis, it wouldn't probably cost much to the main players, and it would probably help address a lot of concerns by other countries. You could also have it outside of the WTO. It's also a possibility. If you look at, for example, what's happening in the TPP or in Asia Pacific, you could have something like that introduced in those agreements. That's also a possibility. Or have a kind of completely standalone agreement that would at some point be brought back to the WTO. Of course, if you want this to work, you will need to get on board a lot of, well, some at least critical or important developing countries. We might have to think about special and differential treatment kind of provisions. But again, these are all things that are completely open for discussion. The idea was just to start and initiate that discussion. This is something that UNCTAD might want to also pursue, at least as being a place where these issues could be discussed.
Vera, before turning the floor to you, I wanted to push Christophe a little farther on this issue, because it gets to the heart of one of the questions we've been asked about what kind of new trade policy institutions we might need. And the question is this: why do we need an agreement? Why does it have to be an agreement as opposed to an understanding or discussion? So the first question is, I suppose, one of formalism. Why do you talk about an agreement? And the second, and this again I think increasingly is something we have to ask ourselves, is business asking for it?
Yes, well, we've considered also the option of a kind of voluntary thing that would be, a kind of code of conduct on a voluntary basis. That might be easier. Is it going to address the issue? I'm not sure. Now, is the private sector asking for it? Well, there has been quite a lot of interest, actually, from the private sector in such an initiative. One of the reasons why the private sector is interested is because increasingly we're talking about global supply chains. To really get the kind of efficiencies that you need, this kind of agreement could be useful. Just to give you an example, in sectors like, for example, wind power, you have a lot of power plants that don't actually run to their maximum capacity. Now, if I have to say, if I have a government that asks for local content requirement, I will need to set up a plant in each and every country to meet that local content requirement. Whereas I could perfectly, with this kind of plants running at lower than full capacity, I could perfectly export some of this energy in different places. So that might be an area. That explains why the private sector has been particularly interested in that. Basically, the notion is that we need, for the kind of scale up that we need to have markets that function properly, and global supply chains that can really, be used to their most efficient possible way. And for that, you probably need to tackle some of the problems and the barriers that we're facing, be it in local content requirements, being in regulatory frameworks, be it in even tariffs. I mean, we still have some important tariffs on a number of goods that are important for renewable energy.
Vera, please.
First, Arthur, sorry, exchange rate misalignment is not a problem only of Brazil. As I show you in the graphics, it's quite spread. Countries with devaluated currency and countries with underdevaluated countries. Now, in the case of Brazil, you are fighting hard, but against $6 trillion of quantitative easing from the US and the community, forget about it. It's quite a complicated issue. But again, all the countries has the sovereignty right to get what they want in their exchange rate. It's the policy of the country. What I'm defending here is that from certain level, this affects trade, and this can, you need to go to WTO as a task for a remedy on this. And this goes to the Draper question. Look, you have a remedy in the IMF on Article 4, saying countries cannot manipulate their own currency. But this is an issue for the IMF. But you have in WTO our famous Article 15, the old GATT, saying that countries shall not frustrate the objectives of the negotiations of the agreements with trade and vice versa. So the question is how to go to this. If you go to the history of the old GATT, you have a famous guidelines in 1980. It's marvelous guidelines saying that countries with above 15% valuation of the valuated can ask to the old GATT, the contracting parties, to renegotiate their specific tariff. That's exactly the point. So you have the jurisprudence already, not jurisprudence, but you have the history of GATT saying that you can do this. On the other remedies, come on, no country is going to ask for, to raise or cut all the tariffs. It's not a very same thing to do, but certainly you have other instruments. Again, in the Havana Charter, it's amazing. Australia make a proposal about anti-dumping currency. It's amazing. It's there in the history. But again, you cannot use anti-dumping because everybody's saying you cannot use it. There's a lot of discussion about subsidies. Can you take the issue on using anti-subsidy remedy to your currency exchange devaluated again or not? This is the point is either members take care of this or this you finish in a panel. And I don't think that the appellate body that is so famous and so doing so much good work, that what members are going to do is to ask for the appellate body to discuss an issue that must be discussed by members. That is a political issue. Again, currency policy is a thing for the governments to do. Second, they are sovereign to do this. What I'm asking for is to neutralize when their currencies are really too much devaluated. That's the point, to discuss how much is this, it will be for the members again. Or you give the power to the authority saying, okay, you do it through a thing that you can do that is a kind of subsidies. That's the way to do it. But again, you have to negotiate it. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. My name is Nikolai Imboden from Ideas Center. I just have a remark and then a question. It seems to me, if I understand something, what came out of this is, one is inclusive trade. To get inclusive trade, we need other instruments which are not trade. It's really basically all outside of the trade policy. And we are saying implicitly or explicitly, we are unable to negotiate anything. We haven't been able to negotiate Doha, which is a relatively simple thing compared to what we are talking now of getting in many other issues. And then we are talking about negotiations and about institutions which are actually not fit to do the job, as they have shown. I would say, let's forget about WTO. Let's forget about UNCTAD. Let's get new actors together, new processes. We need to have a process which actually allows, forget about getting the finance minister or the national bank to come and discuss with the trade agreements or at UNCTAD issues of their purposes. I mean, that's just unrealistic. You don't know the process. We need new avenues. We need new ways to negotiate. And as a matter of fact, it happens. We should not forget. I mean, somebody was talking about the private sector, the interest of private sector in some of the issues. It is happening today. The private sector, for instance, the big supply chain, what do they worry about? They want to be correct, not to get into trouble, not because they are ethical, but they don't want to be accused by the consumer agencies that they are exploiting people or destroying the environment. They're looking for the governments to help them to say, well, what are the defense mechanism, that means standards and how we can defend it. They realized that the government were unable at the international level to fix those standards. And in the internal level, once they got attacked, they were unable to defend them. So they went to certain NGOs and they make agreements with them to say, okay, if we follow these principles and you monitor it, and it's okay, you don't attack us. And it works. It works in the environmental issue, it worked for palm oil, it worked for labor issues, etc. So maybe we are looking at the wrong negotiations at the wrong place and at the wrong actors. And maybe we should take our reflection of who are the actors that we can use to actually discipline the multilateral system.
Any of the panelists want to respond on that? Bernard?
Let me just respond to a couple of things that have been put forward. I think one on this question of, okay, what if we are wrong? And I think it's quite likely that we're going to be wrong, but I don't think it's particularly relevant from the perspective of the topic that we're talking about, which is inclusive growth and what should governments do, which is the question that was posed. And I would argue that a large part of that agenda is kind of relatively well known. So in a sense, where we end up in 2050 is very much endogenous to policy, and what we should be trying to do is try and improve the policy set that will lead towards, stronger inclusive growth. And I think a lot of the things that have been said here, and certainly I think with respect to kind of dealing with this agenda of the investment climate, the operating cost for firms, bringing trade costs down, but also in terms of the connectivity dimension of, linking up different parts of the country so that people actually are connected to markets. I think that's an agenda which I would argue should be pursued in any event from an inclusive growth perspective, independent of how high that growth might be, independent of whether China and India collectively are going to account for the majority of the world's GDP. So I think we need to kind of separate out those two issues. Now, of course, insofar as we are wrong with respect to these projected growth rates, that will have implications in terms of demand for resources, et cetera. But again, I think from the perspective of national governments and the policies that they should be pursuing, I think a lot of that doesn't matter too much. And if you get it right, then obviously we will have higher growth, hopefully over the next 20, 30 years than we might otherwise have. So I think that's one argument I would make. And it is very much, and I agree with what was said, there is a big agenda there still out there in terms of non-tariff barriers, in terms of how high these trade costs are, the trade facilitation agenda, et cetera. So I would just say, let's not give up on that, and let's think, about what national governments can and should be doing. Now, there's a lot of focus here about negotiations, where do we need multilateral cooperation, but I think, there's a large part of what needs to be done can and should be done by national governments. Of course, it's very nice if the rest of the world cooperates, if they reciprocate, and so forth, but at the end of the day, for most governments, that's not something they can influence if we're realistic. On the point, Nicholas's point, in terms of, a lot of things are happening outside of multilateral institutions, and I think that's absolutely true. And that is also the case for the trade front, right? We've already talked a little bit about plurilaterals, but if you look at where governments are going in terms of international cooperation, that's what they're doing. We have the TPP, we have this discussion about an international services agreement, we have what the European Union is doing with respect to bilateral negotiations, right? Trying to negotiate an FTA with India, with Mercosur. So I think that's really where the dynamics are, and I think that's just the reality of the fact that the multilateral system really isn't delivering what a lot of member governments would like to see it happening. So I think they're bringing in and thinking about how do you bring in, especially the private sector, is I think something which is quite important. And because the agenda is increasingly, it is of a regulatory type of nature. I forget who made the point, but a lot of these regulations we have do reflect objectives of governments with respect to social objectives, non-economic objectives. They're there, they're legitimate, they're important. And the private sector, of course, is directly affected by all of these types of regulations. So I think kind of moving towards a system where you actually have more of a dialogue, more of a discussion along the lines of what we have in some other organizations, but we certainly don't have it in the WTO, where they don't even have standing in terms of having that type of a discussion. I think we need to move in that direction. And then the longer it takes, I would argue, for the WTO to kind of recognize that reality and move beyond the ambit of officials the less relevant it's going to be able to actually deal with this agenda in terms of multilateral cooperation. But again, I would stress, I think a large part of this agenda is really up to national governments to pursue.
Peter, I think you've got a challenge there for the session that you'll be chairing later on the Pradeep Mehta.
Thank you. I'm Pradeep Mehta from CUTS. Let me just react to some points made by Bernard and expand them into what we think should be the challenges for government in future. And I think the point which Bernard made about regulatory standards and a dialogue among all regulatory agencies has been missing. We do have the ISO, but they work in silos with the WTO or the trade process itself. Which leads me to the other point, is one of the biggest challenges for government, as we have seen ourselves, in which I'm going to speak about tomorrow, is that all governments work in silos. And we've come across very interesting evidence to show as to how the Agriculture Ministry is never a part of the trade policy discussion, when a large part of trade policy relates to agriculture. Bernard, one important point for you, and that I hope it is provocative enough, is the work that you and many others are doing, which you yourself have reflected in a different manner, is the issue of a multidisciplinary research approach. The issue of human element is missing. The issue of economic efficiency versus equity is missing. Now, you're not looking at the vulnerability elements of the people who are affected by the trade policy or the trade aspects of, and let us not forget that perceptions matter hugely. Perception may be far from reality, but perceptions matter hugely, and this has come up again and again in the work that we've been doing at the grassroots. And you can get positive perceptions also, but usually you get a lot of negative perceptions. Taking on from what Nikolai spoke about, the fact is that on a particular issue, you may bring in NGOs to talk about it, whether it is environment or labor, etc. But then that, again, is a very siloed approach. It doesn't look at the impact of any trade issues. And here let me use the word trade as a more holistic concept of economic policy making, because the trade policy is a part of the holistic economic policy. And therefore, what the bank, the WTO, and UNCTAD need to do is to tell governments that, A, you stop using siloed approach, and we will also stop using siloed approach in order to address these issues. And this is something which I have seen very sadly absent in my last 25 years of experience of talking about trade policy on various fora. So Vera picks out a very sexy topic about exchange rate, fair enough. But then would people understand as to how exchange rate is going to make any difference at all? They won't. What they will understand is when their own money depreciates, and therefore there is a cry, and let's not try to find economic reasoning in it. There is a cry that my own money is now traveling less than what it used to travel in the past. Thank you.
Do you want to?
No, just quickly, I agree. I think this problem of silos is pervasive. It's very pervasive inside the World Bank. It's very pervasive inside any organization that I've ever worked in, and it's certainly an issue that is a big challenge for government. So I think focusing more on that and bringing in the different parts of government that actually have a role to play and an impact on trade and the incentives to trade, I think is very important. I don't know if it's politically correct to mention the cotton case, that in India, for example, where just from reading the newspaper reports, the impression you get very strongly is that there wasn't a whole lot of coordination inside the government when that decision was taken. So I think that's just kind of a very kind of topical example, but I think it's something that is very pervasive. And I think that is, if we don't deal with that more efficiently, we're not going to make a whole lot of progress, because there are reasons for those silos, aside from just human nature and turf bureaucratic incentives. But, people do have mandates to do a particular issue. And if that issue has spillover effects on an issue that is addressed somewhere else, or that is not addressed at all, then there really is that coordination problem, both in government, but also in all of our organizations. And I think we really, I don't have any magic solution to this, but I think we really need to start by bringing people together in the same room to actually talk about, okay, what are we doing and what are the effects we're having in another domain? And that domain might be economic efficiency, that domain might be vulnerability, impact on the poorest households. But again, it starts by at least having that discussion and having people also then put forward and do the background work that needs to be done to actually speak sensibly about, okay, this is what is really the impact of what we're doing. Right? Talking in a vacuum is not particularly useful. So I think really for that to be effective, you need to have it informed by analysis. You need to have something on the table to actually say, okay, this is what the current situation is. This is the impact we're having. And then let's have a discussion as to, okay, how do we get to a better type of environment? How do we improve the situation? And I think, again, can that be done in the WTO? I have no idea. Can it be done in UNCTAD? I think, in principle, in an organization like UNCTAD, that should be much easier to do. And if you think about why was UNCTAD set up, it's really about trade and development. So I think that should be a more natural venue to actually have these types of discussions. But I think it really is a challenge for all of us in terms of pushing that agenda. I know that my boss, Robert Zelek, this is something he talks about almost every day inside the World Bank, right? And so we've been really trying to deal with that agenda and that issue, and it's not easy.
Thank you. Cristina Hernandez from the Mission of Mexico to the WTO. I wanted to thank the panelists and everybody for the very rich discussion, and not let pass the opportunity to ask Vera a question and follow up a little bit on her presentation. I found it a bit of a shame that she was going very quickly, because some of the slides were very interesting, and I would like to maybe sometime come back and at the moment just ask her a question about those countries. You mentioned there are countries with the currencies undervalued, some of them, and some others, several of them, with currencies overvalued. Actually, what I understand is you are making a case for the role of the government in case there is this disalignment in currencies, to come and act as protector to the industry, in domestic industry, and renegotiate agreements or denunciate existing agreements that have been beneficial to Brazilian industry so far. But now, because you have this problem, you want to change the rules. And then you mentioned that in the WTO you are not seeking or willing to discuss or to negotiate exchange rates disalignment by themselves, but probably kind of special exemption or safeguard based on those guidelines that you mentioned from 1980. I wonder what will say other countries which have also overvalued currencies, like Switzerland, let's say, or Norway, or some others. Are they, well, tomorrow and the day after tomorrow, I understand, and I hope you will be very active participating in this discussion in the WTO under the working group of debt, trade, and finance. But I wonder if the answer was that, what would be, first of all, the situation in the international and multilateral level if we generalize this kind of action by the government? And what happened, for instance, in a country like Switzerland, which in spite of the currency problem they have had of overvaluation, I mean, they have taken a different approach and they have fixed the currency value, but still they are overvalued. The Swiss franc is still overvalued, but they still are competitive. They still are having a very positive trade balance. And therefore, my question is whether we should also look at other solutions in the case, in what regards the role of the government, because instead of only acting as a protector, what about rethinking the strategy of industrialization? Somebody mentioned we should maybe think again about industrial policy, and that industrial policy should include trade and development, because instead of closing the borders or increasing the tariffs, I understand it's your proposal, maybe thinking about how do we integrate better our industries in the global value chains. The industries will need imports, and if you raise your tariffs, your imports will be more expensive, and now we are all interdependent because of these global value chains. So or diversification is another alternative. But I thought that perhaps if you could help us with your, the thinking you have done, I'm certain, other alternatives than just having the government and run and close the borders to partners. Thank you.
Thank you for your observations. First of all, I'm not defending, certainly not, to change the rules, but to use the rules. And I fully agree that you have the responsibilities of the country to do what they need to, but they are also the effects of other countries in your country. I'm not saying that Switzerland has a problem, because Brazil has a problem because of the surge of imports that this the policy. So the country is trying to do it. It's trying to in the case of Brazil, cut the interest rate. It's a huge magnet to bring speculative capital. It's true. It's trying to cut all the taxes, internal tax, but you still have a surge of imports. And then the question is, what are the fair and legal instruments we have? I'm not advocating to raise tariffs. That's the case, because I fully agree you have to be in a global world and you have to import components and so on. What I'm defending here is to use for the sectors that are really receiving this kind of surge, that are destroying industry. And then you have now in Brazil very clear, the big issue now is deindustrialization. That's the issue. And the question is, if we do not have instruments here to deal that are legal, fair in the term of trade, you can start, perhaps using other not quite clear and legal instrument. That's the point, to protect it in the way. So this is the reason why I'm advocating for the use of instruments that are more targeted, that as a kind of anti-dumping or anti-subsidies, much more than this. So, and again, it's a different problem of Switzerland and in Brazil, certainly, you have it. And the most important thing is that it's not only Brazil that has this problem. There's a lot of developing countries with overvaluated, in Africa and South America, with overdevaluated currency. And again, it's not, look, this is a thing that I'm listening a lot and reading a lot in Financial Times. That's the fault of Brazil in doing this, the way why Brazil is advocating this. This is not true. First, there are a lot of countries, and here in this global world, it's not only a question of having overvalued currency, just a fault of a country. Sometimes you cannot, even you can make a restriction of capital inflow in a country, you cannot, because you have a huge amount of capital floating around and looking for good interest rate opportunities. That's the point. There's a problem of the two sides of the countries with a lot of volatility of capital, and the countries with a problem of big interest rates. So it's more deeper than this.
Thank you. We've been discussing a lot about the challenges of the 21st century economy and what does this mean for governments. But I'd also like to ask participants in the panel about the opportunities. We're talking, is it global value chains, new sources of investment, for instance, coming from developing countries, new markets in developing countries or others. So I'd like to ask them first what some of these opportunities may be, and second, what role for governments, and in particular for trade policy makers, in increasing a developing countries' firms and workers' opportunities to participate of these, the firms and employers' capabilities in terms of participating in these opportunities in the 21st century.
Who would like to begin? Craig? No? Bernard? No, please.
Well, I think the opportunities, again, it goes back to how realistic were Christian's, numbers, and the numbers we're seeing from all the forecasters who are extrapolating away and seeing all this huge growth in developing countries, not just emerging markets, but also the other developing countries. I remember one of his slides, you really see a great expansion in terms of the share of GDP of the non-BRICS. If you look at the projections for Africa, a pretty large number of African countries are going to become middle-income countries over the next 20 years. So, there's clearly that creates huge opportunities, right? So the rising middle class that Christian was talking about, I think creates huge scope for greater exploitation of those opportunities in terms of for everybody, really. So again, that's, I think, the opportunity is really conditional on all that happening, of course, but I think that really is one of the positive dimensions. I think services has huge potential, and we've, of course, already been seeing that happening over the last couple of decades. But I think if you think about, again, from the perspective of inclusive growth and where are the employment opportunities potentially going to be, increasingly, if you look at trade on a value-added basis, a very large proportion of total value-added are services that are embodied in goods, services that are traded directly. Translate that back again to the inclusive growth agenda that we're talking about here. Giving people opportunities to participate in that is going to be a very important part of the equation. And I think here, in terms of bringing women into the labor force, for example, there is huge potential to actually leverage those types of opportunities. And I think, again, it comes back to what should governments be doing. And I think one of the things governments should be thinking about is how do we establish the preconditions for us to be seen as the place to go to for particular types of services, particular types of activities. And I think that, there is, if you want to call it industrial policy, fine, but there is a proactive need for government to actually take actions. Partly it's going to be regulatory reform, it's going to revolve around the labor market, it's going to revolve around those types of traditional issues, but partly it's really very directed types of activities so that if multinationals come to the country and they ask the questions, okay, do we have this type of plant in terms of infrastructure? Is this type of infrastructure available? The answer is yes, and we have the capacity to actually engage with investors on what they need to do. I guess maybe this will come back in the afternoon session when Ottaviano Canuto is going to be in the panel on diversification and competitiveness. That's one of the things that clearly needs to be done by government. You need to be receptive. You need to have the mechanisms in place to actually have that dialogue with both actual investors and potential investors, so that you have that feedback type of loop. So you quite frequently see investors coming in, but then it doesn't expand. And then the question is, I think governments need to ask themselves, okay, why is that happening? What can we do to kind of move along the extensive margins, so that you move away from just servicing a couple of markets, but there's hundreds of markets out there. So how do you kind of facilitate and encourage that process of diversification? But I think there are huge opportunities there in that, and it revolves to a large extent, I think, around the services agenda and space.
If I might key off a little bit from what Bernard is saying, I think it's important to recognize the distinction here between trade policy and trade. and within trade policy between trade negotiations and what governments do. And I think what Bernard has been stressing throughout is there's an awful lot of space for national governments to operate. I think we're making a mistake if we assume from the start that there's a great deal that needs to be done multilaterally on these issues. And specifically in the area that Bernard's mentioning, services, I'm a very serious GATS skeptic, but I'm a services enthusiast. And I think that there's been a great deal done on trade and services and almost none of it done as a consequence of GATS. These things have been done at the level of national governments. Most of the liberalization in services can be attributed to, in the first instance, technological change, in second instance, countries' reforms and liberalization, some of which gets locked in the GATS, but GATS has not caused a great deal of this liberalization. So the main point I want to make, just again in complementing Bernard's point, is trade policy is very important in these areas, but trade policy making at the multilateral level is not always the institution that matters.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, just to try to answer the question, opportunities. Again, based on these predictions about the growth of middle class and basically the need to enhance productivity and efficiency to meet increasing demand, well, some of the figures that I've seen is that the vast majority of the opportunities are actually in developing countries in terms of increasing productivity, increasing efficiency. And so if we look at the positive kind of side of how do we respond to this increasing demand, a lot will actually probably come from developing countries. If you look at, well, the case of Africa, I mean, China has become the second trading partner of Africa after the European Union. This is a major opportunities for Africa. Of course, there is a challenge behind it, which is, in a way, how do you make sure that this actually promotes structural transformation, and that you don't end up in a situation where, you know, Africa continues to trade, you know, raw materials and so on and so forth. So there's a challenge that comes with it. Generally, I would agree with the view that services is important. I think the other element that one should also take into account, and this is something, an area where the WTO has been doing a lot of work, is this notion of the made in the world. The world has changed. No, in the past, you were supposed, I mean, you produced a car entirely in your own country. This is not the case anymore. You have more the kind of trading in task and trading in components and these kind of things, which makes it in a way kind of easier for countries to get integrated in the global supply chains. And I think that's a major also opportunity, particularly for developing countries. How do you make sure that you get connected to those big supply chains? Again, here you have a challenge. If you go back to Africa, clearly, well, Peter is here. He knows much better than I. But this whole issues of global supply chains has, by and large, you know, bypassed completely in Africa. At the same time, we know that the geography of these global supply chains might be changing in the future. So the big issue is that how do we make sure that Africa can get actually integrated in those supply chains, and what governments might be able to do to try to facilitate this kind of integration in global supply chains. It probably has to do a lot with regulations and not so much with tariffs as in the past, but that's probably also an area with great potential.
Let me jump in the new issues in PTAs, but I can tell you this is amazing. China is really innovating in it. It's not enforceable yet, but China is innovating, putting a lot of issues that I said, I can believe that China is doing this. So things are happening in the regional area. So if you want to innovate things in the trade regulation, certainly regional arrangements are the place. I'm against it. I am a multilateralist. And what's going to be the board with, so what's the role of WTO if this is happening? So this is the issue that I told you before, that the WTO can be not only a diplomatic fiction, but you lose the whole of dictating the rules and negotiating the rules on trade. But go ahead and take a look of what's going on in the regional arrangements regulation. You're going to be amazed. And I agree, they are doing it very, very, with exploring new opportunities on this. All the labeling, all these issues and technical barriers and all of this. Exactly what you want, that other actors get in the role of dictating rules.
I wonder if I could ask Bernard and Craig to push a little farther on this question of adjustment. And Bernard talked about adjustment net of transfers. And for reasons of time, Craig kind of passed over the programmatic dimension of how he would do adjustment. So I wonder, is there a disconnect between what the two of you are thinking about, or are you thinking about the same sorts of things that governments can do to promote adjustment? Bernard, can
I think my focus was much broader than Craig's. Drake's talking about trade adjustment assistance and related types of programs. What I was talking about is a much broader kind of set of policies which really kind of focus on the inclusion dimension. So, which means bringing more people in to the group of people who are actually benefiting from and who can participate in the opportunities that are created by the trading system, right? So it's really this connectivity dimension. It's linking farmers up to local markets, connecting those markets to wholesale markets. So it's that agenda on the real kind of infrastructure side, but also in terms of giving people the skills that they need to be able to participate again. So if you think about services, you know, there has to be a minimum level of skills in order to be able to be employed in these types of activities. So that would be my take on that in terms of the that particular dimension. So I would argue, and again, like Craig was saying, there's a very strong philosophical, I think, split between people who really focus on trade as a source of shocks and trade as a source of adjustment pressure, as opposed to how do you deal with shocks in general, which may or may not be trade related. It could be the weather. We have technology and technological change, which is in practice one of the major drivers of adjustment pressure in economy. So I think I would really focus on that in a more general kind of ambit. I think the trade adjustment assistance, narrowly defined, and Craig is the expert on this, is very much tied to kind of how do you actually move forward on the liberalization front? How do you ensure that the people who worry about being directly negatively affected by greater liberalization, you know, how do you deal with that in terms of the political context of getting legislation passed through Parliament? And, you know, how do you actually move that process forward? But I think that's just one dimension, I would argue, especially from the perspective of inclusive growth. I mean, the agenda is much, much broader.
On just picking up directly from that point, on trade adjustment assistance, there's two very different grounds on which the argument is made that people who lose their jobs as a consequence of trade liberalization, or at least we can associate it in some sense with trade liberalization, that this is different from people who lose their jobs because their firm was mismanaged, or there's been a technological change, or because they're, for one reason or another, this is what happens in the evolution of an economy. One is the argument, and there is some literature out there on this, that there are some differences between the, I don't like this term, trade-impacted workers and the types of skill sets and the types of firms. And Bernard was quite correct earlier in referring to the issue of size here and the conundrum that we face, that on the one hand it's the larger firms that are better able to weather shocks to the system. It's the smaller firms that we look to generate new employment. So there's technical issues involved in analyzing the extent to which there may be a difference between those workers who are affected by trade and those who are not. That's the technical argument. Then the political argument to which he was referring is again that question of a confidence-building measure, treating trade-affected job loss as being, in some sense, fundamentally different. And we can be cynical about this if we want, for the immediate political need, and we usually think about this at the national level, of getting things through our parliaments, but I think it also is equally important at the international level in negotiating agreements, being able to get negotiators to be more ambitious in how many sectors are put on the table and how deeply we cut them. There is more research now taking place in my field, in political science, and the extent to which having programs like this in place may actually affect the willingness of legislatures to take action, although there's also some very interesting research showing that the very presence of there being trade adjustment assistance programs in public opinion may have a negative impact, because to the extent that the public at large becomes aware that there is such an association, at least some of the recent research shows that it has a negative impact. So these are areas that, as in all fields, study evolves and we learn more and more about it. I wish I could say that in a simple axiomatic way, if you have these programs in place, you're going to be able to liberalize more. Of course, it's more complicated than that, but we're studying it.
So I could, for my purposes, I could take from both of you the sense that the confidence in the ability to adjust, both in the immediate aftermath of liberalization, but also in taking advantage of opportunities, is part of how we reduce uncertainty, provoke investment, can be part of it. Okay. The Ambassador of Colombia, I think, was...
Thank you very much. Let me start by congratulating Guillermo Valles for this very good idea of convening this discussion. And I'm just sorry that not more of the trade diplomats have not attended. It is a shame, because we should be here being very active, not only listening but also participating. First point is that trade policy has a limited role on an influence on inclusive growth. Trade is just one of the tools to achieve economic growth and development. And the large role that public policy as a whole plays should not be forgotten. My second point, Bernard Hoekman has talked about the right sorts of policies at the national level, which are sort of horizontal policies, to create the right conditions for markets to work well. I would argue that at the international level, we also need concerted efforts for markets to work well, and to have the right rules and conditions for those markets to operate. And in the last few years, we have not done a very good job of that. As the world changes, as business needs changes, as trading patterns change, the rules need to be updated. And we simply have not been able to agree to develop the rules, the new rules that are needed to keep up with the changing role. So at the WTO, at least, we have been dysfunctional, and we are not being able to talk, and we are not being able to cooperate. And I'm afraid that that gap there has to do with the larger international political situation. My last point is about Vera Thorstensen's very interesting presentation. I would like to press her a little bit more on the specifics of the tools that you are suggesting that we use to deal with the exchange rate misalignments and its effects on trade. And I would finally say that not all, but some of the rises in capital flows have to do with our own either real or perceived successes as national economies. That is the particular case of my country, Colombia, which has been greatly affected by a revaluation of the peso. And a lot of the capital flows that we've seen have to do with increased foreign direct investment. Thank you.
Ambassador, thank you very much for your comments. If you press me a little bit more, I'll say I'm going to go a little bit further. Let me emphasize, I'm here as an academic person, and I'm really happy being an academic person in this issue. Again, what are the tools? Let me be provocative again. Why we have this problem here? It is because if you go to and I recommend you to read a nice book that just appeared, that the name is Currency Wars, from a journalist. This is nothing new. We have this already. What's new now is that we have different countries dealing with the issue, right? And I'm quite aware that the countries, several countries in South America, are a problem of overvaluation. There are many reasons, but one of the reasons that capital is looking for some advantage of in a speculative way. But this has consequences also. If your currency is valuated and you can do, and again you have the old tradition of IMF, don't touch your capital account, don't do anything, and now, well, finally, from 2010 on, now you can read IMF saying, okay, you can take care of your currency. And so this is changing also. My point is, if you have the valuated currency, you are giving a subsidy to your export, and you are creating a new taxes on your imports from other countries. This is Keynes, pure Keynes. Right? So, and if you talk about a new tariff on your imports or a subsidy to your export, sorry, you have to discuss this in WTO. So the posture of countries say, no, this is not a WTO issue. This is really sorry for the persons who are looking and understanding it on the point. And I'm studying a lot what are the tools to solve it. And again, the tools, and I said earlier that to raise tariffs across the board, this is a killing, you have a killing effect on your industrial activities. Nobody can say about this. The renegotiation of tariff, again, this is a thing that, come on. But it's funny, I heard said, oh, this is not transparent, if you have to change your tariffs. And I said, what is not transparent is the effect of exchange rate on tariffs. That is not transparent. Nobody's taking care of the effects. And the profile I show, it's clear that you have a huge impact, the currency rate on your tariffs. Forget about tariffs if you're not taking care of your currency rate. That's the point. Again, there is, I'm against going to a panel of this. I don't think that the appellate body is the right group to say a thing that is the sovereign of country to have, that's its own exchange rate policy. But if you ask me, with the existing rules, and I'm saying again to the representative of Mexico, I'm not proposing to change the rules, using the rules that we have, in my opinion, the best one would be to use anti-subsidy instrument. That is, you go, you study, you analyze it, you make an investigation, and go to discuss and ask for who are the sectors who want this kind of, has this kind of problems. The sector you say to you, ask for investigation, go to the government and say, and ask for an anti-subsidy to discuss this. This is old as the Havana Charter. Go to the Havana Charter and go to see what the proposal of Australia at that time. Australia asked for anti-dumping exchange rate, currency, but I think that a subsidy will be more approval to this.
just to kind of react a little bit to this, I mean, I think you need to you need to kind of square the circle here, because if you're really saying the exchange rate is, a problem in the terms of, affecting competitiveness, and that other countries are undervaluing their exchange rate, and then say, well, the way we want to react to that is by targeting particular sectors, I don't think that really computes, because the exchange rate affects all activity, right? So from that point of view, just simple economics would suggest that if you want to, and I'm not talking here about WTO issues, but that you really then should do it across the board. Right, so and I think one of the problems you get into kind of just logically, if you're saying, okay, we have this exchange rate driven types of issues, but we're only going to intervene for a particular sector, then in a sense you're kind of undercutting your own argument with respect to that we need to deal with that in that way. I really don't see how you get away from, if you do go through this WTO track, how you get away from actually using tariffs at the end of the day, because if other countries don't do anything, then that's going to be the only instrument you have. So I would argue that you either do this and say, okay, this is where we're going to go, and we are going to raise tariffs across the board, or complement it also with export subsidies, because again, that's again, in the theory, that's where you would go, and then just say, okay, that's what we're going to do. But I think as soon as you go down this track of saying, okay, we're going to do it for particular sectors, then, it gets even murkier than it already is. So that's just kind of a reaction to that. I would echo the points that were made by other people on this in terms of, how do you manage capital inflows? The point made by the Ambassador of Colombia, ideally, of course, you want that going into foreign direct investment. You want to kind of have that capital to be sticky, kind of help improve the productivity, competitiveness of activities in countries. I think this global value chain argument that was, I think, mentioned by somebody from the floor in terms of, you don't want to raise kind of the costs of engaging in that type of an activity either. So I think, focusing more on the cost side, I think again, I don't remember who made that point, but I think focusing on kind of improving the competitiveness is clearly something that needs to be done in parallel in order to deal with kind of appreciating exchange rates, which at the end of the day, especially for natural resource economies, are going to be very, that's going to be simply a fact of life. I mean, you're going to be generating a lot of capital, so that needs to be managed. Just one point on the adjustment, which I would like to make on the, following up on what Craig said. I think we need to make a distinction between kind of traditional trade liberalization, where you have workers in an industry which are subject to more competition from imports and which need to downsize, downscale, or might even disappear, from what is increasingly now the trade policy agenda, which is, again, this regulatory dimension of trade policy. And a lot of what that generates are real trade costs, right? So you're not going to have those types of effects. Instead, what you're talking about is more of a political economy situation where you have a number of people in or outside of government who are sitting on rents who are going to lose those rents because we're going to change those particular types of policies. But we're not really talking about kind of industries that really need to adjust a lot. If we can bring those costs down, everybody in principle will benefit, except insofar as you have people sitting on either at the border or behind the border who are collecting rents as a result of the enforcement of these types of policies. So I think it is a different type of political economy insofar as you start from a situation where tariffs are relatively low. If tariffs are still high, I think the traditional kind of adjustment issues come up.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Marcelo Delanina. I'm counselor at the Brazilian mission to the WTO here in Geneva. And of course, listening to the debate and to the interest that the issue raised by Professor Torstensen has raised with the audience, I think that perhaps I should try to also make my comments on the issue of the exchange rate misalignments, and particularly regarding the initiative of the workshop at the WTO. That was, of course, as we all know, a Brazilian initiative since the very beginning. What strikes my attention and curiosity here today is, of course, the level of interest of this issue here, but not exactly the level of interest, but the level of concern. The level of concern. I'm not going into the technicalities of the issue. I think that Professor Torstensen on this occasion should be the person to answer in terms of more technical aspects of this particular issue. But what I've heard here were basically coming from the audience expressions of concern. The question that has repeatedly been made to Professor Thorstensen is, what are the tools? What are the tools under the WTO to address the issue of exchange rate misalignments? Well, it is because of that that I think it might be useful to provide some explanations here. As we all know, Brazil has introduced 2 proposals under the WTO regarding this particular issue, and addressing several different aspects and with several different goals. The Secretariat was instructed to carry out a review of the literature on the issue. That was the first step. And then this particular workshop that is to start tomorrow is also another outcome of these particular proposals. And with those first steps, what we want to do is precisely to make sure that there is a debate under the WTO on this important issue. Because, of course, and as we all could see here today, the debate on this issue can be extremely complex, but it's hard to deny that there is a problem out there, and that this problem might cause consequences. Consequences that might affect all of us negatively in ways that are not exactly how we want things to develop. Now, I can understand expressions of concern, and I can understand the anxiety to learn the solutions and ask, what are the tools? Professor Thorstensen, please provide us the tools, the solutions. But that's not what we are asking. What we are asking is something that also I think I heard here today. I think I heard here today people talking about the need for organizations and institutions to be more open, to engage in dialogue, to think outside the box, though this expression was not exactly used, but I think that is what people had in mind. And I particularly and personally think that those that argue for that are right. The moment calls for that kind of attitude. Now, what we're trying to do is precisely that. I don't think Brazil ever said we had the solution. But what we're trying to do, what we're trying to say is that there is a problem out there, and that there is no point in trying to pretend there is none. So the invitation for finding solutions and to identify what the tools might be is actually open to everybody, because it's not a single country's problem. It's a problem for everybody. So it is with this kind of idea in mind that we hope to see you all tomorrow, also in the workshop at the WTO. Thank you very much.
I have 4 people on the floor, so perhaps I should.
2 minutes to answer him.
Not even. 30 seconds to answer him?
Okay.
30 seconds.
Hockman, thank you very much, because you put the finger on the point. You have 2 problems. One is for the countries that would overvaluated, that's Brazil, and I agree with you, tariffs is the way to be to solve it across the board. But you don't solve the issue of under the valuation. And this is the point, and I really thank you for your observation. You have 2 problems, and you have to have 2 solutions. One is for the country with overvaluation, and for the countries that are using the currency undervaluated, is this I am proposing to use anti-subsidies. That's the point. There are 2 problems and 2 different issues to discuss. Okay?
Thank you. Malcolm, did you...
Yes, thank you, Robert. Malcolm Spence from the Caribbean. One of the challenges that we have in trying to address the issues both at the multilateral level and at the national level is the size of our economies. And I think that makes an important difference. Bernard mentioned it in terms of a big significant effect when you're talking about the size of firms. But when you're talking about size of economies, the effect is also the same. In terms of, as I'll mention later on, how you try to think about diversification, when you have a very small economy, diversification, even thinking about it, becomes a challenge. When you're trying to look at trade adjustment possibilities, then almost the sum of money is not so important because the range of options are already limited because of the size of your economy. And in many ways, I think much of the discussion does not address some of the issues that have to do with differentiation between economies. Now that I know is certainly going to be provocative because there's a lot of political value that has been placed in having unified positions in negotiating arenas. And I think there is good value there. But when the rubber meets the road and you have to do things for your national economy at the level of national governments, then I'm afraid that individual differences do matter. And in our context, size really is a very significant issue.
Sir.
Thank you. Luis Lima Campos from the BCI Institute and American University Washington College of Law. I just wanted to add to Vera Thorstenson's point and maybe address some of the comments by Bernard Herkman. And very quickly, as a major proponent of the use of countervailing duties in the case of currency misalignments, and I'm not going to go into technical details here. There's a full article that I'll be glad to share with whomever wants that. It's only going to be public in October in the Journal of World Trade, but in the meantime, if you like the draft, I'll be glad to share it with you. The most important point, in my view, is that countries suffering from currency misalignments, they're looking for guidance on what to do. And unfortunately, we have the problem already raised here that the World Trade Organization simply is not discussing the issue as one would expect as a member country. And I'm very happy that the issue has been raised here and it's under discussion. And the fact that is happening today is that we're seeing the worst of all possible worlds. We're getting into a competitive devaluation situation. We're getting into countries without knowing what to do, getting into unilateral protectionist measures, questionable, some of them, under the WTO. And instead of using the rules that exist today and that can be used to defend if a country can prove that it's suffering injury from this sort of practice. Bernard mentioned the case of this being an across-the-board effect, and it needs to be dealt with and across the board. The problem with that, Bernard, is that in practice, this would need a change in rules. And I don't see it in practice how this is going to work. Since we cannot agree on the Doha round, we cannot agree on most simple things like trade facilitation. How are we going to get into a discussion as to what across the board measures we can use to stop this or to let member countries defend against that? So I'm very skeptical that we would, in practice, it's logical from your common point of view, but I don't see it working in practice. And that's where I see the problem is. So I believe that using the rules is a much better alternative than letting things be the way they are and trying to hide the problem under the carpet. Thank you.
Mr. Haddad.
Thank you, Mr. Wolf. Isidoro Odara from Uruguay. I would like to comment on the matter of exchange rates. We have been exposed to a very interesting point in which we are lacking some of the tools to face the problem posed by real exchange rates misalignments. And we've just heard that we have two problems and not just one set of problems posed by those countries that have overvaluated exchange rates, and it's our case, and another one for those who have undervaluated exchange rates. In fact, real exchange rates drive a wedge between tradable and non-tradable goods. And tradable goods are not only importables, they are also exportables. So we have four and not just two dimensions to this problem. And if we only react in the import side, we are charging the burden on our exporters, not only of the overvalued exchange rate, but also of the decrease in demand for foreign exchange because imports have been drawn down by extra tariffs or whatever other subjects. So we have to be very careful. We are facing perhaps not two but four dimensions of the problem. And if we make the competitive part of our economy suffer twice, then we may have to take a look at internal trade-offs. This is the first comment I wanted to make, and I want to make another one, which is related to this one. Some 30 years ago, I was in Geneva, and we were discussing how to shape the subsidies code. And there were seminal works at that time coming from, I recall, Professor Larry Shackstad from Chicago, through tariffs and through subsidies and international trade. And it might be the case that at that very early time, people were thinking that through tariffs were tariffs discounted misalignments, and through subsidies were subsidies discounting the misalignments they were trying to mitigate. And if this is so, we might have to look at literature 30 years ago to make it a more complete approach to this very exciting subject. Thank you very much.
Thank you. My name is Bernard Niembo. I'm from the Democratic Republic of Congo, but I'm here for my business. I'm an entrepreneur. Talking about the challenges and the opportunities, I would like to bring 2 points. Number one, I think we need to integrate the role of the diaspora. The diaspora, especially the African diaspora, is contributing to the economy of the countries more than the local government. So we need to integrate them because we are talking about new issues. It might be a good idea also this is the second point, to integrate women, because in Africa, and I think in most developing countries, women play a big role in the economy, in creating jobs. And we need to think about how to integrate the diaspora and the women in order to create jobs, to create employment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. In the, sorry, one last question, Ambassador.
Thank you. My name is Ronald Saurio. I'm the ambassador of Costa Rica to the WTO. I have a question with regard to this discussion that has captured our attention in the last minutes, which is the exchange rates and trade. If this is already in the rules, If the Havana Charter and the current rules are so clear, why not to apply the rules in order to have a solution? Why a workshop if the rules are so clear? Why not take action and apply the countervailing duty and let a panel decide if the other delegation reacts? I'm a bit confused.
Thank you.
I'm sorry. We've got 5 minutes left. We have really 3 different topics on the floor in which I'd like the panelists to reflect in their final comments I'll give to everybody. The first is about whether size matters. The second is about the role of diasporas. And the final question is on whether we don't simply apply the existing rules. So, Christophe, do you want to go first?
Well, sure. Well, on the diaspora and the women, I think it was essentially a comment, and I would basically agree with it. Size matters. Yes, I mean, impossible to disagree. I mean, you're absolutely right. It's a fact. Going beyond that, to what extent, in a way, I guess the issue you're raising is the issue of differentiation. No? And I think people are trying to escape this discussion, but at the end of the day, one will have to confront it. Be it in the WTO, be it in any multilateral negotiations or negotiating fora. I think that this issue of differentiation, in other words, how do you deal with different countries at different levels of development, and what kind of specific kind of provisions you would need to design to address their concern, is something that we will have to address. I mean, if you look at what the WTO and the way in which the WTO has responded to this in the past is to do it in a very pragmatic way. No? So you don't create new categories of countries, but at the same time you insert lots of caveats in a lot of different provisions, and you have a kind of de facto reflection of this differentiation. Is it something that is sustainable in the longer term? I don't know. I mean, one of the big questions is how do you deal with emerging economies? I mean, one of the main reasons why we haven't been able to conclude this round is basically what kind of level of commitment do you expect from the emerging economies and vis-a-vis other countries. So I think we'll have to tackle this issue. Is it by looking at the countries themselves and trying to come up with new categories of countries? This is probably not going to work, not going to fly. One other option is to look at the different situations in which countries are finding themselves, what kind of special provisions they would need depending on what they produce, what they export, the structure of their economies, and how we can reflect that in the rules instead of trying to have rules that apply to countries or different categories of countries. That requires, of course, a lot of analytical work, a lot of thinking. But I think at the end of the day, the system has no other ways than to confront the issue and address it.
Well, I'd be happy to address 2 of the 3 issues in the same comment with respect to size and to diasporas. One of the problems that I see consistently in many developing countries that I work in is the inability to achieve economies of scale. It is a serious problem, certainly in the Caribbean and in a great many other areas as well. If you cannot achieve an economy of scale, what you have to do is use a small size to your advantage in niche markets. And one of those niche markets is the diaspora. In some of the countries that I've worked in, there are goods and services both in the diaspora market abroad, exporting specialty fruits and vegetables, assuming you can get past the SPS barriers that we have in the major markets. There are some things that are comfort food for folks in the diaspora that they're not going to get any other way. except this way. I'm working in the Gambia right now, and one of the things that we're talking about is diaspora tourism. And that is an advantage that the Gambia has that really needs to be more fully exploited. They cannot fully compete with the sun and sand tourism of a lot of other countries, because many countries have sun and sand, but only the Gambia has a town called Kunta Kinte. So there are answers here not in trade policy per se, but in trade. And sometimes we have to think very creatively about if we cannot compete in the economies of scale, then look for the small but profitable responses.
Okay. So on the 3 points, I think really the big challenge here is for small island economies, because I think scale obviously really matters a lot. I think we have 50 plus countries in Africa. Many of them are quite big, but many more are quite small. And I think so regional integration, integrating those markets regionally is part of that solution, but that's not really a solution that you have if you're an island in the Pacific. So I think there are very specific challenges there for which there are no easy answers. And I think part of the answer in practice has been movement of people. So I think Craig's point in terms of leveraging the diaspora there is one potential dimension to that solution. But I think I fully agree that size really does matter, and I think that's one of the kind of positive dimensions of integrating markets regionally and the processes we're seeing now pretty much happening all over the world, including, importantly, in Africa. I think on the diaspora, I again agree with what people have said. I think the suggestion is a very good one. And I think the focus tends to be a bit too much on remittances. So a lot of people, when they think about diaspora, eventually what we're talking about is getting money to flow back. So the focus has been on remittances. I think remittances are obviously very important. They're an important source of funding for countries. But I think much more important is to try and encourage people to come back, to actually link it to foreign direct investment, to creating employment opportunities. And that's really where we're going to get, again, I think, the traction in terms of the inclusive growth agenda that we're focusing on. And again, that requires government. It's not going to happen naturally, so you really have to proactively put in place those types of programs, chase people, which has been done by a number of countries over time. So there's lots of models, I think, that can be drawn on, and the lessons from those experiences can be captured. I think on the exchange rate issue, I just wanted to make sure that people don't think that I'm advocating this. So the broad-based tariff, it was basically an analytical point. If we really are talking about the exchange rate as a problem, then in terms of if you want to use trade policy to address that, you need to use a mix of tariffs and export subsidies that needs to apply to everything. So that was the point I was making. I think Mr. Hodara already kind of pointed towards the complexity of this agenda. We're not just talking about 2 margins, we're talking about 4 margins, and I think in practice we're talking about more than that as well. So I think trying to use trade policy instruments to deal with this agenda, I think, is something which is going to be much more of a problem than a solution. So I think this, again, I don't want to get into this issue. You're going to have 2 days of debate on this. So I think everybody who's going there will have an interesting couple of days. But again, just to be clear, I wasn't advocating that we do this.
Okay, first, exchange rate's not an issue of only big countries or emerging countries. All size country has a problem with exchange rate. I fully agree that is a quite sensitive issue. The history of exchange rate and trade is as old as the world, and you have several attempts. And all the times, the conclusion, this happened in the Havana Charter, this happened with the negotiation of subsidies code, the talk around, it's happening again. The question is, one day you have to deal with it. And the point is, perhaps this is the time to deal with it now, because it's really distorting trade. And more than this, is undermining the whole institution, the whole system that you are creating and trying to build for the last 60 years, 70, almost 70 years. That's the point. So, and again, this is a point to be discussed, Ambassador Saborio. It's not a point to go to the appellate body. This is not the function of the mandate of the appellate body to solve an issue. It is with us since the beginning of the trade system. Sorry, but that's the truth.
Before turning to the organizers for a brief housekeeping word, please join me in thanking our panelists for really a very stimulating opening discussion. Miho, the floor is yours.